She was sold at auction while still bleeding from birth, but one rancher bought her just to give her. Nevada, 1878. The sun burned Silver Creek white, the air heavy with dust and heat. In the square stood the auction block. A frail woman, Ellie Mae, still bleeding from childbirth, clutching her newborn, chained to a post as if she were livestock. The baby whimpered, too weak for a full cry. The crowd pressed close, their jeers rising with the auctioneer's voice. 2 for 1. A young mother and her squealer. Who'll start the bidding? Coins clinked, voices shouted numbers. Laughter rolled like thunder. Ellie swayed, her eyes half shut from pain. Her hands locked around the child as if her arms alone could shield it. The auctioneer's hammer swung high. 300. 350. Then a voice cut through the noise. Steady. Startling. Final. 500. The crowd stilled. Men turned. At the edge of the square, a lone figure stood with dust on his boots, broad-shouldered, sunburnt, gaze fixed on the woman. Farmer Thomas Hale. Thomas Hale had not always been a man who spoke so few words. Once, his days had carried laughter, song, and voices that gave a house its warmth. But now, his world was measured in the scrape of a hoe against hard soil, the lowing of cattle at dawn, and the quiet hiss of the wind across the Nevada plains. To most who passed by, he was just a farmer with a stern face and shoulders bowed under years of work. A man who kept to himself. A man with no interest in company. But Silver Creek remembered who he had been before. Years back, when Thomas was 24, he married a girl named Margaret. She had auburn hair that shone like flame in the sun, and a voice so soft it seemed to turn even harsh words into blessings. She had grown up in the settlement, one of the few women educated enough to read scripture aloud on Sundays. Thomas had loved her fiercely, in the way quiet men do, not with fireworks, but with a steady flame that burned sure and constant. Their home had been a modest cabin near the northern ridge, built with his own hands from timber he cut himself. He carved her a rocking chair as a wedding gift, smoothing it for weeks until the wood felt like silk. Margaret would sit there in the evenings, reading aloud as he mended harnesses or sharpened tools. Her voice filled the silence he had inherited from his father, who'd raised him with more commands than kindness. A year into their marriage, tragedy struck. A fever swept through Silver Creek, merciless as wildfire. The physician's wagon could not reach every household, and even when it did, his bitter tonics often failed to cure. Margaret fell ill first, her skin burning so hot Thomas could scarcely bear to touch her hand. For days he sat by her bed, sponging her forehead, whispering prayers into the night, bargaining with a God who remained silent. By the week's end, her breath grew shallow, her lips dry, and in one terrible dawn she was gone. Thomas buried her on the ridge behind their house, beneath the pine she had loved in springtime. Neighbors came to the funeral, offering words that felt like echoes in a canyon, hollow, fading. He said nothing in return. From that day forward, his world grew quieter still. Not long after, misfortune struck his younger sister Ruth. She was 17 then, bright-eyed and quick with laughter, though still too young to bear the burdens life thrust upon her. Their parents had died when Thomas was barely a man himself, and raising Ruth had been his charge. He tried to shield her, but grief left him weary, and Ruth, lonely, trusting, fell into the orbit of a man who promised her safety. His name was Silas Brewer, a rancher with money enough to impress, and fists quick to fall when promises soured. Within months of marriage, Ruth's joy was dimmed by bruises and silences. When Thomas confronted Silas, the man spat tobacco at his boots and told him to keep to his own house if he wished to avoid bloodshed. Ruth begged her brother not to make things worse. For the first time in his life, Thomas obeyed fear instead of conscience. He stepped back. He did nothing. That choice carved a wound deeper than any blade. So Thomas retreated into his farm, into labor that numbed the ache of loss and the shame of helplessness. He worked from dawn until stars salted the sky, his back bent over fields that never gave as much as they took. He ate alone, slept alone, and if neighbors spoke to him at market, He answered with the briefest nods. The town called him strange. Some said his heart had frozen, that he had no use for fellowship. Others muttered that men who lived too long in silence grew dangerous. Thomas let them talk. The land became his companion, the soil his confessor. He poured grief into furrows, sorrow into seeds, regret into the calloused hands that built fences against coyotes and men alike. But even solitude cannot hold forever. On some nights, when the wind sighed through the eaves of his house, he would imagine Margaret's voice again, or hear the echo of Ruth's laughter before life had ground it into silence. Those memories tormented him more than comforted. They reminded him that he had once failed to protect those who had needed him most. They reminded him that his strength had proved useless in the moments that mattered. That was why, in Silver Creek, he walked with lowered eyes, avoiding the sight of women burdened with children, or wives shadowed by their husbands' tempers. He could not look at them without remembering the weight of his own failures. Better to stay apart, better to till his land and shut his doors. And so the seasons passed. Years piled up like dust on the ridge. Men fought and died in skirmishes out near the border. New settlers came. Fortunes rose and collapsed in the mines. But Thomas lived unchanged. The only new grave on his land was the calf he'd buried last winter after a sudden freeze. He spoke to no one unless necessary, and even then, his words were blunt, clipped, as if each one cost more than he was willing to pay. Yet life, as it always does, was circling back toward him, ready to shatter the fortress of silence he had built. When he walked into Silver Creek that sweltering day of the auction, he had not intended to take part in anything beyond purchasing supplies. His wagon was nearly empty of grain, his tools needed oil, and he thought only of practical matters. But when the crowd gathered in the square and the voices rose, curiosity, or perhaps some quiet hunger he did not name, pulled him closer. And there he saw Ellie Mae, chained, trembling, blood still fresh between her thighs, an infant pressed to her chest. The jeers of men turned her motherhood into mockery, and the hammer of the auctioneer struck the block as though she were no more than cattle. In that instant, Thomas felt a sharpness he had not felt in years. It was not desire. It was not even pity. It was memory. Margaret's still body, Ruth's silent pleas, all the faces of those he had failed. They rose up like a tide, and before he could stop himself, he was already stepping forward. The words he spoke, 500, were not just an offer of coin. They were a vow born of grief and guilt, a vow that this time he would not turn away. And so, without knowing it, Thomas Hale had taken the first step out of exile. The square had not gone quiet for long. After Thomas's bid, a murmur rippled through the crowd like a wind across prairie grass. Confusion, suspicion, and envy mixing in men's throats. $500 was more than most of them earned in a year, more than a wagon or a fine horse might fetch. And to spend it not on land, not on cattle, not even on a healthy bondservant, but on a broken woman and her half-dead infant? It was madness. The auctioneer blinked, stunned, before regaining his patter. 500. 500 to Mr. Hale. Do I hear more? 550? 6. But no other voice rose. No man in Silver Creek was reckless enough to cross Thomas Hale, nor foolish enough to match a price so ruinous. The hammer fell hard. Sold! Ellie Mae lifted her head at the sound. For the first time since she had been dragged onto the block, her gaze locked on the man who had spoken. Her eyes were not grateful. They were wild, sharp with mistrust. The eyes of a cornered animal who had learned the cost of believing a promise. She tightened her grip on her child until the baby whimpered, and a thin thread of blood slid down her wrist where the iron shackle had chafed skin to rawness. Thomas pushed forward through the muttering crowd. He handed over the heavy purse that had hung at his belt for months. Money saved for new plowshares, seed grain, and a roof repair he had put off since spring. The auctioneer weighed it, his eyes gleaming, then handed Thomas the iron key. The townsfolk drew back as Thomas approached the block. A path opened, not from respect but from curiosity, from the hunger of those who wanted to see what the strange farmer would do next. Up close, Ellie looked even smaller than she had from a distance. Her dress was stiff with dried blood, her skin gray with exhaustion. The child in her arms made weak, fretful sounds, its breath shallow as though each lungful of air was borrowed. Thomas knelt. He did not speak at first, only slid the key into the lock and turned. The shackle fell away with a heavy clink. Ellie flinched at the sound, her shoulders jerking as though the chain had not only bound her, but become part of her flesh. "You're free," Thomas said, his voice low. Ellie's eyes narrowed. Free was a word she had heard before, only to learn it meant another form of captivity. She staggered as he helped her down from the block, and for a moment Thomas thought she would collapse. But she held herself upright, trembling yet unbroken, clutching the child so close it was hard to tell where mother ended and infant began. The crowd jeered. $500 for a corpse and a brat. Hales lost his mind. Maybe he wants himself a broodmare. Laughter scattered like stones. Thomas's jaw tightened, but he gave no reply. Words could not silence men who fed on cruelty. He lifted Ellie gently, one arm beneath her knees, the other bracing her back. She stiffened, her hand disappearing into her sleeve where something glinted faintly. A small knife, hidden but ready. Her gaze flicked toward his throat, then down to the child in her arms. Thomas felt the sharpness of her intent like a knife already pressing against his own flesh. But she did not strike. Not yet. The wagon stood at the far end of the square. Thomas walked slowly, steadying each step so as not to jostle her. The murmurs followed, a chorus of speculation and derision. Ellie stared over his shoulder at nothing, her face a mask, the baby's cries a fragile rhythm between them. Inside the wagon, Thomas laid her gently on a blanket. The wood was rough, the air heavy with the smell of hay and iron, but it was more shelter than she had known for days, perhaps weeks. She pulled herself into the farthest corner, knees bent protectively around the infant, the knife still clutched in her hand. It was then that Ruth appeared. Thomas's sister had slipped into town unnoticed, her bonnet pulled low to hide the bruise that marred her cheek. She moved like a woman hunted, yet her eyes, when they met Thomas's, carried a flash of relief, like a bird sighting home after long exile. "Tom," she whispered, her voice raw from the miles she had walked. For a long moment, brother and sister simply stared at one another. 8 years had passed since her marriage to Silas Brewer, 8 years of silence and distance. But now she was here, in his wagon, her bundle of belongings no larger than a sack of flour. "Ruth," Thomas said softly. Ellie's eyes darted between them, calculating. She pressed the child tighter to her chest, her body tense, the knife still hidden in her sleeve. The wagon now held 3 broken lives, each wary of the others, each carrying scars too deep to show. The road out of Silver Creek stretched long and hot beneath the August sun. Thomas climbed onto the seat, the reins rough in his hands. As the wagon creaked forward, the square behind them filled again with laughter, coins exchanging hands as men wagered how long it would take before Hale regretted his purchase. But Thomas heard none of it. His mind was on the fragile weight of trust in the back of his wagon, a trust that could snap at any moment. He knew nothing of the woman beyond her name and her desperation. He knew even less of the child's chances of surviving another day in this cruel heat. Yet something in Ellie's eyes, fierce and unyielding, told him she would rather die than surrender her child again. As the wagon rolled over the dry earth, silence hung heavy. Ruth broke it first. "Tom, I couldn't stay with him. Not anymore." Her voice trembled, not with fear but with the echo of years endured in silence. Thomas nodded once. He did not ask for details. The bruise on her face spoke louder than words. He had failed her once. He would not fail her again. Ellie shifted in the corner, watching them. "Why?" she rasped suddenly, her voice thin as thread. Thomas turned his head. "Why what? Why buy me? $500. For this." She lifted the infant, its small chest rising with shallow breaths. "What do you want?" Her tone was sharp, suspicious. Men did not spend money without expecting return. She had been taught that lesson too many times. Thomas looked at her for a long moment, Nothing, he said simply. Ellie laughed bitterly, a sound like glass breaking. There's always something. A body. A child. A name. Thomas tightened his grip on the reins. I had a wife once, he said at last. And a sister I failed. I can't undo what's past. But today I could choose not to fail again. Ellie's hand tightened on the knife. She wanted to believe him, but belief had nearly killed her before. Still, the words lodged somewhere in her chest, where doubt and longing warred. The wagon rocked onward, carrying its fragile cargo away from the jeers of Silver Creek and into a silence broken only by the creak of wheels and the faint, ragged breaths of a newborn. 3 souls, bound not by blood nor by choice, but by the harsh necessity of survival, rode together into a future none of them could yet see. The road out of Silver Creek wound through gullies of dust and scrub oak, the wagon wheels shrieking against iron rims as though protesting the weight it carried. Thomas Hale gripped the reins with hands that bore no tremor, but his jaw was set hard enough to crack stone. In the back, Ellie pressed her child to her chest, knife still hidden, eyes flicking between her rescuer and the sister who had climbed into the wagon at the last moment. Ruth sat with her bundle clutched to her knees, her face pale with fatigue and the purple shadow of bruises not yet faded. The air between them was thick, a silence sharper than words. Each one carried wounds deeper than flesh, and none trusted the others fully. Night fell before they reached the farm. The house rose from the plain like something abandoned, its timber weathered and roof patched with tin that caught the moonlight in dull sparks. Chickens stirred in their coop, and the distant low of cattle carried across the pasture. To Ellie, who had known only darkened shacks, drunken voices, and the terror of men's boots on wooden floors, this lonely farm seemed both salvation and trap. Thomas helped her down. She resisted his touch, steadying herself on the wagon rail instead. He let her be. Inside, the cabin smelled of smoke and earth. The hearth still held embers. He stoked them into flame, then left them alone to wash while he fetched water from the well. Ellie sat rigid in the corner, knife never far. Ruth lingered by the fire, eyes downcast. Only the child, after feeding, gave out a sigh so faint and trusting it drew silence around it. Days passed. Thomas worked from dawn until dusk, mending fences, tilling ground too dry to yield much. Ruth tended small chores in the house, moving with the tentative grace of one relearning freedom. Ellie stayed near the hearth, guarding her child like a hawk, watching the farmer with suspicion that softened not at all when he left bread by her side without a word. She slept little, always half awake, listening for the sound of approaching hooves. And one morning the sound came. A dust cloud on the horizon, 3 riders hard on the trail. They wore guns at their hips and cruelty in their laughter. Thomas knew one of them, the man who had claimed Ellie Mae as his property, a trader named Jonah Briggs. His voice carried even before the horses drew close. You there, Hale? That woman is mine. That brat too. Bought and paid before you stuck your nose in. Sale was illegal. Hand her back. Thomas stood at the fence line, shotgun across his arms. Behind him, the women froze in the doorway. She's no man's property, Thomas said. Briggs sneered. Law don't see it that way, and law's what I carry at my side. His hand dropped to his revolver. The men flanked him, their horses stamping, eyes fixed on the house. One spat tobacco juice into the dirt. Funny thing, Hale, your sister ran from her husband too. Seems you collect what ain't yours. The words struck Thomas like a lash. Shame burned through him, shame of all the years he had done nothing. His grip faltered. Briggs saw it and smirked. Thought so. Weak man. Step aside or we burn you out. The world seemed to narrow. The long fields, the sky, the years of silence. All to this fence line. The past pressed against Thomas's chest. Margaret's fever, Ruth's bruises, Ellie's chains. If he stepped back again, if he let them take her, then every death and every wound would stand on his shoulders. His hands steadied. You'll not cross this line. The standoff broke like glass. One rider spurred his horse forward, pistol flashing. The shotgun roared, scattering shot into the air, startling the horse into a rear. but the other two were already drawing down. Thomas fell as a bullet grazed his side. Heat seared his ribs, blood soaking his shirt. The women screamed. Ellie moved before thought, knife flashing from her sleeve. She struck the rider who leaned from his saddle, blade burying into flesh. He toppled, crashing to the dust with a howl. The horse bolted, dragging his gun from reach. Briggs cursed, leveling his revolver toward Thomas, who struggled to raise his shotgun again though blood ran freely down his side. But Ruth stepped forward then. Not with weapon, not with rage, but with voice. Her cry rang sharp across the field. Enough! For the first time, Briggs's sneer faltered. He had mocked her before, bruised her into silence. But the sight of her standing upright, her eyes lit not with fear but with fury, unsettled him. You think you can speak now, woman? He spat. Yes, Ruth said, voice shaking yet strong. And I will never stop again. The hesitation was brief, but it was enough. Ellie lunged again, forcing Briggs to swing his aim, and Thomas fired the second barrel. The blast tore the dirt at Briggs's feet, the power enough to throw him back. His revolver flew wide. Silence fell but for the groans of the wounded. The third rider fled, spurring his horse until dust swallowed him whole. Briggs, bleeding and beaten, dragged himself to his knees. You think this ends it? Law'll hear of this. You'll hang for theft, for harboring a runaway. Thomas staggered to his feet, blood soaking his shirt. Then let law come. But hear me, Briggs, no chain will ever touch this land again. Not while I draw breath. He aimed the empty shotgun at the man, eyes dark as storm. Briggs read the truth there, the kind of truth that broke men's will. Slowly, he turned, dragging his wounded companion onto a horse, and rode away into the distance. The farm stood quiet again, though blood stained the ground. Ellie dropped the knife, hands trembling. Her breath came in sobs, half relief, half terror. She looked at Thomas, at the wound seeping through his shirt, and for the first time the hardness in her eyes cracked. She knelt beside him, pressing torn cloth to his side. You fool, she whispered. You bought me, you bled for me, why? Thomas looked at her, at Ruth standing with tears streaming down her face, at the child stirring weakly in its swaddling. Because no one saved mine, he said. The words settled between them, heavy with grief and truth. That night, the three of them sat by the hearth. Ruth sewed Thomas's wound closed with trembling hands. Ellie rocked her child, whispering soft words. For the first time since the auction block, her knife lay forgotten on the table. Outside, the Nevada wind moved across the fields, carrying away the last echoes of gunfire. The Hale farm did not rest easy after the fight. Though the riders had fled, their dust still clung to the horizon, and in the silence that followed, unease seeped into every corner of the house. Thomas lay weak from blood loss, his wound bound with Ruth's careful stitches. He would not admit how much each breath cost him, but his pale face betrayed the truth. Ellie hovered at a distance, torn between mistrust and duty. The memory of Thomas standing before Briggs, bleeding yet unyielding, gnawed at her. Men she had known before would have traded her life for a coin, a drink, or a moment's amusement. Yet this one, silent, stubborn, scarred, had spilled his own blood to keep her free. She did not know what to make of it. For a week the farm grew tense and watchful. Ruth moved quietly about the chores, her bruises fading but her eyes still carrying the shadow of Silas Brewer, the husband she had left behind. At night she woke from dreams, clutching her blanket as though fists still rained upon her. Ellie saw it, and something within her stirred. A recognition, a kinship in wounds unseen. The baby, weak but alive, brought brief moments of light. Each small breath was a defiance. Each tiny cry drew them together, for all their fear and mistrust. Thomas, even in pain, would lift his head when the child whimpered, his gaze softening in a way Ellie could not ignore. But safety was fragile and danger was not far. On the 7th morning, hoofs thundered again. Not 3 this time, 10. Men rode with rifles slung, faces grim beneath wide-brimmed hats. At their center was none other than Silas Brewer, Ruth's husband, flanked by 2 deputies from the county seat. And beside him, bitter-eyed and bandaged, sat Jonah Briggs. The riders drew up before the gate. Dust swirled, horses pawed the earth, and the farm seemed to hold its breath. "Thomas Hale," Silas's voice carried across the field, cold and triumphant. "You harbor thieves, whores, and runaways. The law stands with us now. Hand them over or we drag you out with the dogs." Ruth gasped, retreating into the shadow of the doorway. Ellie pressed the child to her breast, her knife hidden once more in her sleeve. Thomas stepped forward, pale but unbroken. He leaned heavy on the porch rail, his wound stitched yet raw, but his eyes held a steadiness born of years of silence and loss. "This land is mine," he said, voice hoarse, "and those on it are under my protection." Briggs spat into the dust. "You think you can stand against us, 1 crippled farmer and 2 broken women? We'll see how long your fences hold when the law tears them down." The deputies shifted uneasily. One muttered, "We came for order, not blood." But Silas silenced him with a glare. The tension snapped like a whip. Men dismounted, rifles raised. Ruth trembled, caught between terror and rage. Then something within her broke free. The silence of years, the weight of bruises, the shame of obedience. She stepped forward, voice shaking yet sharp. "Silas Brewer, you beat me near to death. You called it marriage. You called it law. But I call it chains." The words cut sharper than any blade. The deputies exchanged looks. Even Briggs faltered, surprised by the fire in her tone. Ellie moved too, holding her infant high. "And this child, you'd sell him before he could walk. You'd chain his mother, strip her name. Is that your law?" The men muttered. Some shifted their rifles downward. Not all were hardened. Some were fathers, brothers, sons. Thomas seized the moment. "You men know me. You've seen me in town these 20 years. I've buried a wife, worked this soil till my back near broke. Did I ever cheat you? Did I ever steal from you? No. But I'll not see this ground become a market for flesh." The silence grew heavy. Even the horses stilled. Briggs, red-faced with fury, drew his revolver. "Enough talk. She's mine, by coin and contract." Ellie's knife flashed. She struck his wrist, the blade slicing deep. The revolver clattered to the ground. Briggs howled, stumbling back. Chaos erupted. Some men raised rifles, others hesitated. Silas roared, swinging at Ruth, but she caught his arm, defiance blazing in her eyes. "No more," she said, voice ringing clear. In that instant, everything shifted. The deputies stepped forward, one seizing Briggs, the other blocking Silas. "This ain't justice," one declared. "This is greed and cruelty, and I'll not be party to it." The riders fractured, half turned on their heels, unwilling to spill blood for men already stained with it. The rest dragged Briggs and Silas back, shouting curses but offering no more fight. Dust rose as they retreated, their threats fading into the horizon. The farm stood silent again. The only sound was the soft cry of the child, alive and unchained. Ellie lowered her knife, her hand shaking. Ruth clutched Thomas's arm, her face wet with tears. Thomas himself, pale and bleeding anew, sank to the porch step, the weight of years lifting just enough for breath. They had not won with bullets, nor with strength. They had won with truth, with voices long silenced finally breaking free. And as the sun dipped low, casting gold across the battered farm, the 3 of them understood. The world outside would not forgive, would not forget. But here, within these fences, no chain would ever bind again. Word spread faster than dust on a desert wind. Within a fortnight of the standoff, every man and woman in Silver Creek had heard of the scene at the Hale farm. Thomas bleeding but unyielding, Ruth speaking truth to her tormentor, Ellie driving a blade into the wrist of Jonah Briggs. Some told it with laughter, calling Thomas a fool for defending ruined women. Others whispered with awe, saying perhaps the farmer had finally found his purpose. But in the Hale house, there was no room for boasting. Thomas's wound reopened twice, each time leaving him pale and trembling while Ruth boiled water and stitched again with shaking fingers. Ellie sat near, her baby swaddled in her arms, her knife never far but no longer clutched in constant suspicion. She watched the farmer grit his teeth through pain, and though no words passed her lips, her gaze softened by degrees. The farm became a strange sanctuary. Strangers began to appear at dusk. A woman with a split lip who said little but worked the fields in exchange for shelter. A mother and her 2 children, thin as fence rails, who carried nothing but fear in their eyes. Thomas never turned them away. He set an extra place at the table, or found a corner of the barn with straw enough to sleep on. Ellie watched it happen. At first she thought it reckless. To open doors was to invite danger. To feed the lost was to starve yourself. Yet as the days passed, she saw how the land itself seemed to bend under this change. Where silence once pressed against the walls, voices now rose. Children's laughter, women's murmurs, the creak of rocking chairs at night. One evening, as twilight stretched long and golden, Thomas sat at the table, his sides still bandaged but his eyes steady. Across from him, Ellie shifted her baby to her shoulder. The child had survived his first month, fragile still but breathing with more strength than before. Thomas cleared his throat. His words came slowly, as though each one was heavy. "I never asked your name." Ellie stiffened. For weeks she had been girl, mother, the one from the block. Names in her life had been stripped away, written on contracts, shouted by men who claimed to own her. She had nearly forgotten the sound of her own. She looked down at the child in her arms, then at Thomas. Her voice, when it came, was scarcely more than a breath. "Ellie Jane Harper." The syllables fell into the room like stones into still water. Ruth looked up sharply, as though something sacred had been spoken. Thomas nodded once, as though acknowledging a vow. "For the first time," Ellie whispered, "it belongs to me, not to them." The silence that followed was not the old silence of grief, but a new one, reverent, waiting. Outside, the night deepened. Lanterns glowed in windows, voices hushed, and the farm, battered but unbroken, stood as if rooted not only in earth but in something stronger. Defiance, truth, and the beginning of hope. The days lengthened into weeks. Threats still lingered, Briggs nursing his wounds, Silas swearing vengeance. But word of the deputies' refusal to back their claims dulled their power. Men in town began to see the Hale farm not as a place to test, but as ground too dangerous to trespass. Inside the fences, life changed. Ellie rose earlier, helping Ruth with bread, learning the rhythm of milking and tending. She had been a prisoner so long that freedom felt strange on her hands, but each small act, kneading dough, drawing water, humming softly to her child, was a reclamation. Ruth, too, grew stronger. She no longer lowered her eyes when Thomas spoke. Her laughter returned, cautious at first, then fuller, as though each day pulled her further from Silas's shadow. And Thomas found his silence broken. He still spoke little, but when he placed an extra plate at the table, or repaired a leaking roof before rain, his actions carried words deeper than speech. For the first time since Margaret's grave had closed, he felt the stir of something like belonging. On a late autumn evening, with the sky burning crimson over the ridge, a small gathering filled the farmhouse. Women and children, those who had come seeking shelter, sat shoulder to shoulder around the table. Ellie set down a pot of stew, her baby resting drowsily in Ruth's arms. Thomas remained at the head, hands folded, gaze steady. He did not raise a toast, nor deliver a sermon. Instead, he simply bowed his head, and the others followed. In that silence, unbroken by jeers or chains, Ellie felt something she had thought forever lost: peace. When she lifted her head again, she saw Ruth smiling down at the baby, saw Thomas watching with quiet pride, saw the faces of women who no longer trembled, and for the first time in her life, she believed the world could be brighter than fear. That night, as stars climbed above the desert plain, Ellie stepped outside. She held her child close, pressing her lips to his small brow. The air was cold, but her heart was warm with something she could barely name. Freedom. It was fragile, like a flame in the wind, but it was hers. And she vowed that here, on this farm where blood had been spilled yet compassion endured, no chain would ever claim them again. Winter came early to Silver Creek that year. The first snow dusted the ridge before the leaves had fully turned, and the nights grew so cold that the river froze solid enough for children to run laughing across its surface. At the Hale farm, smoke curled steady from the chimney, and the windows glowed with lantern light. Inside, the house had changed. Where once silence clung to the walls like mildew, now voices rose, soft, weary, sometimes broken, yet alive. Women had come with children in tow, some walking through night with nothing but shawls against the frost, others led by whispers of a place where chains did not reach. Ruth greeted them at the door. She no longer flinched at the sound of boots on the porch. She spoke with calm strength, offering bread, blankets, or simply a chair to sit and breathe. Ellie guided them to the hearth, showed them where to lay sleeping infants, taught them to stir stew without letting it scorch. Slowly, the farm that had once felt like Thomas's lonely prison became a refuge. Thomas himself remained quiet, but no longer hollow. He rose before dawn to cut wood for fires, repaired the barn to shelter more cattle, built crude bunks in the loft so weary bodies might sleep without fear. When newcomers thanked him, he only nodded, but each evening he laid an extra plate at the table. That act spoke louder than words. Ellie's child thrived. What once had been weak cries and shallow breaths grew into strong wails that filled the cabin. The boy's small hands clutched at Ruth's hair, at Thomas's coarse shirt, at the world itself as though unwilling to ever let go. Watching him grow, Ellie felt a wound inside her begin to close. Not the scar of what had been done to her, that would remain, but the ache of believing her child doomed before his life had even begun. One night, as wind howled across the plain, Ellie sat rocking her son. Thomas worked at the table, mending a harness by lamplight. Ruth dozed near the fire. The moment was so ordinary, so gentle, that Ellie found herself smiling without realizing it. The sound startled her. A laugh, faint but real, spilling into a room where once she had only known silence or fear. Thomas looked up. Their eyes met. Neither spoke, but something passed between them, not of ownership or debt, but of shared survival. By spring, word of the Hale refuge had spread beyond Silver Creek. Families traveling west stopped to rest there. A widow fleeing her husband's kin found shelter and stayed on, teaching the children their letters. A girl of 12 arrived barefoot, carrying a brother even younger. She had no parents left, but she found many mothers beneath that roof. Not all welcomed this change. Men in town muttered that Thomas was harboring strays and trouble. Some predicted the farm would starve under the weight of so many mouths. Yet when those same men's wives came quietly at night, bruised or weeping, it was the Hale farm they sought, and it was never the door that turned them away. Peace did not mean safety. There were still threats. Riders passed now and then, watching from the ridge, their intent unreadable. Briggs nursed his bitterness in saloons. Silas Brewer vanished but not forgotten. Still, no attack came. The deputy's word had carried weight, and perhaps even men of violence had learned that the Hale farm could not be broken by force. Seasons turned. The baby's first steps brought laughter to the yard. A garden flourished where barren soil had once resisted every seed. Women sang as they worked, voices carrying on the wind, strange and beautiful against the harsh Nevada plain. And always, at supper, Thomas placed one more plate than there were mouths. Sometimes it was filled, sometimes it waited empty, but the gesture remained. A promise, silent yet binding, that no one seeking refuge would be denied. Years later, Ellie would remember one evening above all. The sun set behind the ridge, painting the sky with fire. She stood outside holding her son, no longer an infant, but a boy strong enough to run across the yard. Ruth called from the porch, laughter on her lips, her hair catching the last light. Inside, women stirred stew, children quarreled and played, the house alive with a warmth Ellie had once thought impossible. Thomas stepped from the barn, his shoulders bent with work but his eyes steady. He paused, looking at the scene before him. The boy darting between his mother's skirts, Ruth smiling without fear, the home alive with voices. For a long moment he said nothing, but the quiet around him was no longer emptiness. It was peace. Ellie felt it too. She pressed her son close, breathed in the scent of dust and wood smoke, and let herself smile. Not from fear, not from defiance, but from something gentler. Hope. The world beyond remained harsh, full of men like Briggs and Silas, full of markets and chains. But here, in this place carved from grief and guarded by compassion, another truth endured. That kindness could outlast cruelty, and that the smallest act, buying freedom at an auction block, placing one more plate at a table, could turn despair into sanctuary. The Hale farm was not perfect. It was not safe from every storm, but it was brighter than before. And sometimes, as the wind moved through the fields, carrying the laughter of children across the plain, it seemed the land itself had learned to breathe again.